Welcome. We have Dr. Jeremy England with us again, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. We hope you continue to find these shiurim as stimulating as I do. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So I have a topic today that one certainly has to treat very carefully because it touches on a very legitimate topic in our tradition, which is Tchiyat Metim, sometimes translated as the resurrection of the dead. And I think it's a topic that has to be treated with reverence and caution for many reasons. But I think it's an especially important one to try to think about when asking about points of intersection between how the world looks from the standpoint of Torah versus how the world looks typically from the perspective of scientists, because Tchiyat Metim, the returning of the dead to life, I don't know if you could easily claim it is certainly the most implausible or most problematic thing that we associated with emunah, with religious faith, from the standpoint of maybe the typical view of a scientist, but it's certainly up in the list of competitors for that title, because I think it is, when we don't examine the question of what is being said and what's being talked about very carefully, it certainly sounds to people like, oh, well, if you look at the world as a scientist does, you know that things like this are impossible. There's no reason to talk further about it. And it's clear evidence that having a religious faith requires you to take an attitude about the world and what you can expect from it that would cause you to have to sort of blind yourself to certain truths about the world or put your head in the sand. So I think it's very important as a topic to take the bull by the horns. And at the same time, I think also it has to be acknowledged that our tradition takes a very sidelong approach to this topic. And I apologize, I didn't get all the sources into this source sheet that I wanted to, so I'll be referring to some that are from memory. But so what do I mean by that? That our tradition takes a sidelong approach to the topic of Tchiyat Metim, the resurrection of the dead. So famously, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, does not seem to directly take up the subject of what happens after one dies. And almost comically, but also I think with a highly serious point to make, the sages of the Talmud, Chachamim, Zichronam Levracha, Chazal, they, in the Talmud, first in the Mishnah and in subsequent commentary, they take the subject on directly with a Mishnah that says that anyone who asserts that Tchiyat Metim, the resurrection of the dead, is not discussed as a subject in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, is an apikoros, is a heretic. However, in saying this, they are immediately inviting a really, I think, almost humoristic discussion that ensues in the Gemara, in the commentary of the sages on this Mishnah. Because, of course, in order to prove that the text of the Torah does take up this subject, you basically have to play word games. So one example that the sages come in to bring is there are verses immediately preceding this song called Parshat Hazinu that comes at the end of the Torah, where Kadosh Baruch Hu is explaining to Moshe that this people, after Moshe dies, are going to arise and go and follow other gods. And so I'm not going to quote the pasuk exactly because I didn't make the source, get the source in, but essentially Hashem is saying to Moshe, now you're going to be gathered unto your people, you're going to be buried, and this people will arise and go worship idols. But the grammar is, now you're going to be buried, and when you're reading the verse, it's, and the people shall arise, v'kam ha'am hazeh, right? But what Chazal do, the sages, they cut it off, and they say, now you're going to be buried, v'kam, and arise. And they say, look, so it's saying he's going to be buried and then he's going to rise up again. So clearly, at some level, someone reading this is not, by reading the text on their own, ever going to come to the conclusion that what the text is trying directly to refer to is anything to do with the restoration of the deceased to life. And yet, I don't think Chazal are merely making a joke. They both, on the one hand, are admitting that, in a sense, although the Mishnah is saying you are a heretic if you say the subject is not discussed in the text of the Torah, there's a plain sense in which it isn't. And that means that the heresy that we're talking about is not someone simply acknowledging the plain meaning of the text, because the examples that they bring essentially push that under your nose. Instead, what it's saying is, if you're going to have to deal with this subject, yes, it's there in our tradition, but it's below the surface. It's in subtlety. It's in changing the way that you read things and realizing hidden meanings in them and realizing hints. And not just in an esoteric sense where it's, all it's sort of secret knowledge that you have to dig for, but even in a sense of saying you need to question the assumptions that you're making in order to understand what is even being claimed or said when our tradition teaches this thing to us, right? That when we say there is Chiyat Mitim, this is often the case, I think, in let's say, interpretation of questions of religious faith in Yahadut, in Judaism, that maybe produce what would look like sort of conflicts or contradictions, that we kind of assume we know in a very simple way what is meant by the thing that we're supposed to be affirming. When in fact, it may be, for example, with the 7 days of creation, the 6 days of Ma'aseh Bereshit and the seventh day of rest for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that when we say, yes, that's the truth that we have from the Torah of the origins of the universe, do we know what we're asserting and affirming simply and obviously when we state that? Or should we be looking carefully at what is meant by that when making that assertion? And similarly here, with Chiyat Metim, I think Chazal are pointing us directly at the possibility that in order to really understand what is being gotten at, it's going to require more intellectual gymnastics than don't cook meat with milk or do not murder or other things in the Torah that are much more direct and on the surface. So that I think is just a first point. The whole discussion we have from our sages is about subtlety, it's about hints, it's about things hiding in the background, and that maybe is both because we need to dig more deeply and also because we need to question our assumptions about what is being claimed and whether we know what we're trying to understand. So that is the first point I want to start off with. And I'll add another source that I didn't make it into the source sheet that I wanted to bring in anyway, which is that in this Mishnah, which I'm sorry I can't quote the exact source for, there's a wonderful subsequent discussion that transpires between Antoninus, who's this possibly fictive or maybe Marcus Aurelius type character, who's a Roman emperor, a philosopher, who is a kind of interlocutor and friend of Yehuda Nasi, and they're having all these discussions about questions that derive from this main discussion about heresy and the resurrection of the dead. And they talk about a lot of interesting things in this passage in the Gemara that ensues. But one thing I believe that is found there, and maybe it's found elsewhere, but I think it's found there, is this question that I think is not definitively answered by Chazal, or it's debated, about when Tchiyat Meitim happens, when the dead return to life, as we have in our tradition, is prophesied and promised. Will they have their clothes or not, is the question. And I think that that's a question just by the fact of it's being asked, it's an important one for us to really contemplate, because it exactly gets at this issue of what do we even mean when we're talking about this? What is Tchiyat Metim? Because your clothes are exactly something that pertains maybe to that which is not central to who you are, but maybe still was a significant part of the state you were in at the moment that you passed away. And now the question is, what about whatever you are at the moment when you pass away remains the same, and what will be different when we have what we would call Tchiyat Metim, the returning of someone who has died to life? What do we keep and what do we, build anew? Is it the case that we're just talking about someone who is kind of biologically resembling you but doesn't have the same memories? Is it, someone who, if they somehow had their life cut short in mid-sentence, that they get to finish their sentence the moment that they wake up. Those are the perhaps opposite extremes. And I think that when we yearn in some ways for clarity on questions like this, we probably would be less satisfied by the idea that one day a biological organism that resembles us physically, but doesn't have our experiences or memories or relationships, might walk the earth. I mean, that is maybe interesting or of some comfort, but it's not the same thing, on the other hand, as sort of waking from the instant of your passing with all the same memories. But then also, there are things that we want to shed, that we imagine in some future, some ideal future perhaps, in which we live. Do we want always to retain everything about the life that we lived previously and carry that forward? Or do we want to be kind of liberated from some of that? Depending on how we died, it might be important to be freed from that. So I think this question about clothing is really getting at that. And it shouldn't be obvious. And it's not something I think, in my recollection, although I'm sorry I didn't manage to dig up the source before this, that Chazal really give us a totally definitive resolution of. So that's another point along the same lines. And then, I want to make a last prefatory point that's stepping out and zooming out from things a little bit and thinking about it like a scientist. And then we can talk about some actual sources and more details of what Chazal teach us. Because it's really from Chazal that we have this. I mean, we have passages in Tanakh that are used by Chazal to give us these ideas, but the exposition of the idea of Techiyat Metim is really very limited in all of Tanakh. So thinking about it as a scientist, as a physicist, as a biologist, on the one hand, I think it's quite clear why many scientists, if you ask them, well, is it possible for someone to live after they've died? And especially after they have been buried in the ground for eons, they would say, oh, well, obviously not. And they would give you various reasons. And in one sense, you have to give credit to people and say, it's not unintelligent of them to make these arguments, but they're always making them based on assumptions. And that doesn't mean that these arguments are untrue or unreliable to a certain degree, but it just means that everything in natural science really works within a modeling framework that makes certain assumptions, particularly in this case about probability. So when someone says you can't return to life after lying in the ground for thousands of years, what they're assuming essentially is that most of what you were biologically and physically has essentially been scattered by all the different biological and physicochemical processes that over a long time take the assembled whole and just rearrange it and share the different material parts around, and you become part of the earth. You're like, we have this idea in the Torah that we are afar min ha'adama, we're the dust of the earth. U'le'afar tashuv, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Adam, right? So, and you will return to dust. And Avraham Avinu says about himself, ani afar ve'efer. And we usually read that perhaps to mean that he's trying to be humble, I'm dust and ashes. But it's also more evocatively true from a physical standpoint, that we're a bunch of material components that are assembled together and can also sort of blow away in the wind eventually when the fire goes out. And so there's a lot of appreciation of the basic material challenge of keeping living things together, if you look for it in the right place in Tanakh. So I think we have to acknowledge, we have to give both, on the one hand, Tanakh its due for acknowledging the intuitive obviousness of the material challenge of returning to life when you have long been buried in the ground. And also, we have to give credit where it's due to the scientific way of thinking. People have done lots of experiments, and they have great theories that explain to them things like when ice melts or when water vapor will condense into liquid. And this has to do with theories of lots of tiny molecules, and there being millions upon billions upon trillions upon many, many, many molecules, and very good models of the probabilities of all of them colliding and doing this and doing that together. And you can do lots of experiments that show that these theories are very good for making lots of predictions of things you can measure. And then what happens when someone tries to imagine the idea of Techiyat Metim is they start using those theories to make proposals about how to calculate the likelihood of something and say, what is the likelihood that molecules would reassemble in the following state, only so to speak, because of the right gust of wind blowing them back together. And you can always construct a model of such scenarios that makes it sound impossibly unlikely. And this is a good time to be talking about this question, because we had a show recently about impossible unlikelihood and Nisim, miracles. We're coming up on Chag Purim, which is one of the times when we commemorate the miraculousness of unlikely occurrences and how it demonstrates HaKadosh Baruch Hu's role in the history of the world. But in the case of Purim, the story focuses on human affairs and unlikelihood of that kind. There's also physical material unlikelihood, right? The idea of what's the likelihood of all the different molecules in the room just collecting in one corner of the room by bouncing off of each other in this sort of grand string of tossing heads a trillion times in a row by accident. And then just, you have a lot of different random collisions of molecules, but somehow all the molecules end up filling a lot of the empty space in the corner of the room and you have a spontaneous vacuum. We don't worry about things like that because they are theoretically extremely unlikely, so unlikely you would never see them in the whole age of the universe. And so, it's not something that physicists lose too much sleep over. But I'll pose to you just one kind of scenario that illustrates to you the trickiness of probability, even just critiquing scientific reasoning on its own terms. So you can make, for example, simulations of a bunch of molecules flying around and bouncing off of each other. There's a technique called molecular dynamics simulation where people do this. And yes, it makes assumptions like all modeling techniques, et cetera. But you can study things about groups of molecules doing things together and likelihood of different things happening. And what is interesting is that you have a lot of freedom when you do simulations to play around. You can kind of run the movie forward and backwards according to the rules of the physics of how these molecules bounce off of each other, right? So you can start, for example, with a simulation of a bunch of molecules that are already in the corner of some room that they're flying around in. And it's true that if they have a bunch of random velocities, because they're just like hot gas at some temperature, or not even hot gas, but just, like air in the room, then when you press play, the simulation will show how they all spread out and they fill the room, and then they stay spread across the room because it's just extremely unlikely that they will do anything else once they spread out over a larger volume, given that all of their velocities were initially random, which is a very reasonable assumption to make. When we try to measure the velocities of molecules, simple random distributions seem to be good models of what they're doing. But now think about the reverse. So let's say I ran this movie forward and now I have air spread over the room. And now I just take all the velocities of all the molecules and flip them in the other direction. So I'm going to just kind of like have everyone who is running this way just turn around and go back the other way. If you do this, you actually, in a simulation, could have a situation where the molecules, they now run back along all their different tracks and bounce off of each other again, and they all go back and they collect in the corner. So the rewind movie runs. Instead of the forward spreading out of the molecules over the room, now they'll all collect back together in the corner of the room. And the interesting thing is that if you go back to the beginning of that rewind movie, you just had air molecules spread out over the room. And actually, there's a lot of things you could try to measure about them that are very difficult to tell that they're non-random, right? Because once everything is spread out over the room, it just kind of looks like normal air spread out over a room. And you don't really know that all the different velocities of all the different molecules in the room are kind of secretly arranged so that if you flip them all around, they'll do the rewind movie and collect back in the corner. There's kind of a hidden order that could be very difficult to detect that just results from the fact that a whole bunch of different, seemingly independent, separate pieces of a system with lots of parts actually have a hidden relationship to each other that's not visible if you just look at one of them or two of them or three of them at a time. I'll give you another example that's a very related kind of thing to do with math and probability. Imagine that I give you a string of just ones and zeros based on coin tosses that I do. If I flip heads, I put 1, and I flip tails, I put 0. And I just toss a coin a trillion times, right? And so now, or let's say not even a trillion times, 100 times. I toss a coin 100 times. So I get 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, some string of ones and zeros from all the heads and tails that I got. But I expect them to be roughly 1 half the time and 0 half the time because it's a fair coin. So now I have this string of ones and zeros. And let's say I do that, a dozen times. So I have a bunch of different strings of ones and zeros. So on the one hand, if I showed you one of these strings, then you would say, oh, this looks like a random string of ones and zeros. If I showed you another one, you'd say, oh, yep, that also looks random. I showed you another one, that would also look random. However, of all the different kinds of strings that you can make this way, of strings of ones and zeros, there are 2 to the 100 of them. 2 to the 100 is an enormous number, right? It's, we're talking like trillions of trillions of trillions. It's a very big number. So you're not going to get all of those strings unless you have a very long list, which means someone could actually have a list of 1 billion of these strings. And on the one hand, 1 billion random strings of ones and zeros. If you study that, you'll just say, oh, this just looks like random ones and zeros. There's no meaning in it. There's no pattern. But if I have only 1 billion of them, 1 billion is a very, very small number compared with 2 to the 100. So actually, if I'm only showing you 1 billion strings of ones and zeros, and I'm only choosing from that little subset, then I have a very special and particular non-random group. But if I show you from that deck of cards, what I'm revealing, it will seem to you like it's random unless you really are good at detecting the relationship that's there. This is just another example that's just trying to illustrate the probability mathematics of situations where something can be highly non-random, but in a way that's very difficult to detect. So why is that important? I think that's important because we have to remember the idea of randomness is a human invention. We have developed the mathematical concept of perfect randomness, like the perfectly straight line or the perfect circle, because it helps us to make mathematical models that make good predictions of certain kinds in certain situations. But no one can prove that the world is random. This is not an empirical scientific question that has yet to be resolved. It is a philosophical question that stands outside of science. You can look at science from the outside and say, oh no, you don't get to prove the world is random by making some finite set of observations. You just get to assume the world is random and point out that it helps you to make models that explain a whole bunch of observations in your experience of the world. Why is that important? It's important because it means that everything that a scientist can say about Tchiyat Metim, everything that they would say about, oh, this is impossible, this is nonsense, don't even bother with it. It's the most obviously scientifically forbidden thing that there is in all of religious thinking and specifically Judaic thinking, since that's what we're talking about here. And it's a nice idea. It's an idea we desire to believe in, but science has already shown it's impossible. So forget about it. Pick one. Pick science or pick Torah. A scientist who says that may be good at making scientific discoveries by sort of toiling in a little garden that someone has prepared for them. But that person does not understand what science is. They are insufficient, or they're let's say, being simpletons with regard to their philosophical understanding of what science is when they say something like that. Because they're not acknowledging that really the unlikelihood or likelihood of anything that we observe in the world always comes from modeling assumptions. And we can argue these models are good for certain purposes, but we can't ever prove that they are perfectly good for ruling out things that are so unlikely that they haven't happened and that we don't have empirical experience of. So the difference between saying Tchiyat Metim, only happens once every million years, or only happens once in the entire course of the universe, in either case, we've had no chance to observe it, versus saying it can never happen, forget about it. We have no empirical experience of that difference. And so we only have theoretical ideas to help us to navigate that discussion. And a scientist who says, no, my theories are perfect, so this must be wrong, they are an inferior scientist to someone who understands what it is to look at science from the philosophical outside and see its assumptions and limitations. So I think that we can, and we're going to get back to how I think our tradition actually appreciates this point quite beautifully. But I think that it's a general point you could even just say from the standpoint of philosophy of science, critiquing scientific thinking and common attitudes found among scientists, you can just say the idea of Tchiyat Metim, of resurrection of the dead, being impossible, it is something that when someone makes that claim, they are actually saying, I'm going to make a calculation based on a certain theory for you. And if we just made other assumptions, we might find that something that we think of as being not possible becomes much more possible. And there's infinite potential for that in the world in general. And it comes down fundamentally to the world being less predictable than we always wish it would be, and our models being less perfect than often scientists hope they are. So no one should be able to say, this is impossible, but they might say, according to these assumptions, it's extremely unlikely. And now I think it makes sense to start to talk about it from the standpoint of our own tradition and see what it has to say about it. So there are two kinds of threads that I want to bring together here, one of which is more to kind of close out the discussion and is a bit more speculative and weird. But first, I think the main idea that I really think coheres a lot with what I was just saying, from the standpoint of understanding the physics, is just this idea that Chazal have given us that Tchiyat Mitim is connected with rain. So the best sources for this are actually further down in the source sheet. It's a little bit out of order. So if we go down to, so these two sources, 4 and 5. So first, starting with source 4, there's this discussion by Chazal, which basically is part of what forms the basis for our tefillah. So there is a bracha in the Amidah. If we could scroll up to source 4, please. There is a bracha in the Amidah, in the standing prayer, thrice daily prayer in the Jewish tradition, that says Hakadosh Baruch Hu is mechayeh hamitim. He is the one who gives life to those who have died. And in that bracha, we say that Hashem is a gibor, that he is mighty, and we talk about different examples of his great might. And some of the things that are listed are mechayeh metim atarav lehoshia, right? That he gives life to the dead, and he is a great saver. He brings salvation. What we also say is he is somech noflim. He supports the fallen. Ve'ofeh cholim. He heals the sick. Umatir asurim, and he frees the imprisoned. And then we return to the idea of umakayem emunato lishenei afar, and he fulfills his promise to those who sleep in dust. But there's another one that really stands out, because in that whole list that I just mentioned, it's things that Hashem is doing for people, right? They're in prison, he sets them free. They're sick, he heals them. They fall, he helps them up. And also, they are sleeping in dust, and he can, help revive them. But there's another one that we mentioned, which, depending on the time of year, refers to a different meteorological phenomenon, either to dew or to rain. But right now, what we say is he is Mashiv Ha'uach Morid HaGeshem. He is the one who sets the wind and who brings down the rain. So that is a little different, because, as I said, it's not as much a transaction between him and a human being. And Chazal makes specific mention, such as in the source here in the Gemara, about the connection between Tchiyat Mitim and rain. Elsewhere in Masechet Ta'anit, also, I believe it's more specifically compared, the idea of Tchiyat Mitim is compared to the condensation of raindrops. So we have this repeated theme, and actually source 5 as well also connects the idea of rain to Tchiyat Mitim, although I'm not going to read through it yet because it's more complicated. But you can leave it on, sorry, you can leave it on source 5, but I'll jump into it in a second. So what is interesting about the theme of rain in connection with Tchiyat Mitim? If you get to what I was just talking about, this idea of improbability, and looking at even from a sort of physical chemical standpoint, what's very evocative about the idea of raindrops is that it's a very simple, tangible example in the experience of a human being, where you both get the idea of the dispersion of a material substance like water vapor over this great space, and the possibility that under other conditions, instead of wanting to be dispersed and spread out, that all of that water vapor could want to become condensed into a droplet that takes up much less space and it's much more located in a particular spot. And that all it takes, as we experience, is a difference in temperature, right? So if I have some water vapor and I suddenly make things a lot colder, you get condensation, you get raindrops, and we're seeing that today in Eretz Yisrael, and you get some rain as a result. And that is, from the standpoint of physics, what's called an equilibrium phenomenon of condensation, where there's just a different stability of vapor water versus liquid water, or vaporous water versus liquid water at different temperatures and pressures. And so just depending on a shift in something as simple as temperature, you could change conditions such that something that really seems impossible to collect together, it's hopelessly spread out over an enormous volume. And you could try to collect it together with your hands and it would be totally hopeless. It just slips through your fingers. It wants to be spread out. And then you change the temperature, and suddenly the same natural laws that give you, on the one hand, spread outness and irrecoverableness of being spread over the whole world, suddenly give you instead this potential for this material to collect together in one place and become kind of a more material and physically located body that then can fall to the earth. Now, does that mean that the reassembly of a living body is as simple as condensing a raindrop? Absolutely not. It is hopelessly more complex on the one hand, but I do think it demonstrates, to me, it's a remarkable intuitive appreciation of something about the physics of this whole discussion, because the same kind of argument that you could make about the unlikelihood of the reassembly of a living body, when you say, oh, well, what are the chances of all the molecules that were over here and over there coming back together into a certain state? That's not actually qualitatively different than the argument that you'd make about what's the unlikelihood of forming a rain droplet, at a very high temperature and a very low pressure, right? That under those conditions, there's just a greater tendency for a vapor to just spread out over more space. And it's just hopelessly unlikely that you're going to get a droplet of liquid in a situation where things are really super hot, as we experience, in the summer here in Eretz Yisrael. So, I think it's obviously a stretch to say that Chazal would have been really making the argument in terms of mathematical probability, but it is remarkable to me that the intuition that follows here in the comparison really parallels an intuition that you get from talking about things in terms of probability and statistical mechanical likelihood of a whole bunch of different molecules or atoms or whatever condensing in a certain way. Now, there are other ways in which life is hopelessly more complicated. But I would also add that there are other ways in which weather is really hopelessly more complicated. Like the gloss that I just gave on condensing raindrops is very simple and primitive. But the true question of when and how rain will appear is a much more complicated question than a little bit of condensation on your window when it gets colder, right? The question of what clouds are doing and what climate is doing and what weather is doing is up there in the titanic competition for what is the most complex thing in the world that it's difficult to predict and always know what's going to happen. And that's why rainfall is very much also in the eyes of Chazal this emblem of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ratzon, that he decides that this can happen because no matter how hard we try, we can't kind of rule the heavens with a rain god of our own crafting. We can't, and this is remarkably true even today, right? We are much better at predicting weather using all sorts of satellite observations and computer simulations, etc. And yet still, despite progress that humankind has made, that progress is really limited to certain domains. And there's even a deeper understanding than there used to be of mathematically why it's very difficult to go beyond a certain level of accuracy when you're trying to predict weather way in advance, right? What is it going to be rainy in Modi'in or in Yerushalayim or in Tel Aviv 2 years from now on such and such a day? It's not simply a limitation of technology that someone can't yet predict that. Even according to the understanding of scientists who study this, there are fundamental things about the equations that people think do govern a lot of these behaviors that make it devilishly difficult to predict that far in advance because of all of the ways that small differences in initial conditions can turn out to lead to huge differences in long-term outcomes. So we are already maybe beginning to appreciate that rain is an even subtler idea, that it's really not an equilibrium phenomenon. It's what's called a non-equilibrium phenomenon that is much more like life. And that's what brings me to this source 5, which I think is a really stunning one and a remarkable one to think of as a non-equilibrium thermodynamicist, which I encountered elsewhere in our tradition, referring to Eliyahu Navi, and the three keys were given to Eliyahu Navi. And I think this is parallel to other sources. But here the Gemara is simply saying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has three keys that he holds in his hand. And it says, which were not transmitted to an intermediary, but I think we elsewhere have a tradition that they were given to Eliyahu Navi. And they are the key to rain, the key to giving birth, and the key to resurrection of the dead, right? So why are those three things listed here? That, I think, is a really profound observation, even from the standpoint, again, of intuition paralleling how we think about these things from the physics. Because rain, as a complex phenomenon of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, is devilishly difficult to predict. And so too are biological things from the standpoint of trying to treat things like deterministic physical systems. Life is also hopelessly complicated. And that doesn't mean you can't learn about it and you can't predict anything about it, but it is very challenging to make totally predictable because of how complexly organized it is and all the different tiny things that can lead to big changes. For example, in a living cell, you could change, let's say, a dozen atoms on one molecule of DNA inside one living cell, and maybe that might cause a genetic mutation that could be the straw that breaks the camel's back and be the beginning, perhaps, of the spread of cancer in a living being, right? So you could change a few atoms. I mean, it's still, maybe one would not go totally noticed, but on the scale of a dozen atoms, you start to be able to do things like change the DNA, and you change maybe, as a result, the health of the overall cell. On the other hand, there are a whole bunch of other atoms in that cell where you could change 100 or 1,000 of them, and it might not make any measurable difference to the biology. So biology is a hopelessly complex organization where some tiny differences can blow up to enormous differences. And also at the same time, it's this seething mess of kind of primitive molecular chaos. And there are a lot of things that don't matter so much. And so figuring out what matters and what doesn't is devilishly complicated, and people work on it and there's progress to be made. But I do think that viewing what is complex about weather through the lens of non-equilibrium thermodynamics, what is complex about life actually does have quite a relationship to that. And then the last one that's mentioned is Techiyat Metim, and the resurrection of the dead. And I think there we have to admit a very interesting insight, which is that, yes, it is true that we don't see examples of Techiyat Metim all the time, right? We don't have an empirical experience of it happening yesterday and today and tomorrow, where we can study it in the same way we can study other things in the natural world. What's also true is that what we do have experience of is gestation and birth. And it is stunning and mysterious, even to the scientists who study it in many ways, because of how complex it is, to witness and behold how you start from something as tiny as a single cell, and you can create the whole developed form of a living being. And that this happens in a partly random or stochastic way, and in other ways, fashions that seem wholly orchestrated in this beautiful pageant. And it's breathtaking to behold. And the more you study it, the more you marvel at it. Even if it becomes more suddenly controllable and predictable to some degree, it still is in many ways unpredictable and in many ways marvelous and seemingly miraculous. And the point is that if you really contemplate what it is to bring a new life into being through the biological process by which people can, you can start with two people and then you can create a third person, and this can happen as a natural process, you start to realize that the thing that you're saying seems so hard and so difficult about Techiyat Metim, a lot of that is kind of answered by the fact that bringing a new life into being from a certain naive standpoint seems equally difficult. So if you just said, okay, I'm going to give you some carbon, some nitrogen, some phosphorus, oxygen, et cetera, whatever, all the different basic materials that you need, can you get this to happen? It is, I won't say there's no wisdom to be gained about how to get going in the right direction, but it is not easy to take those kinds of pieces and put them together such that you can make a living thing. And yet that is what living things do all the time. They take more primitively organized pieces of their surroundings and they turn them into a new living thing that has this majestic and miraculous and amazing organization at all these different levels. So while it is true that the fact that gestation and birth existing, the fact that they exist as observable empirical phenomena doesn't automatically prove that Tchiyat Mitim is an easy thing to make happen. It's also true that if we don't really understand that process yet, and we are, I think, are very far from what we would call a complete understanding of how to predict and control the process of embryonic development and the creation of new life, that it is a bit hasty to say, given the empirical fact of the existence of that phenomenon, that Tchiyat Mitim is just laughable and we shouldn't really think about it at all as something that could one day happen in the same natural world. What we really should be saying with much more humility is there are things that are simpler than bringing a living thing back to life, perhaps, that are still hopelessly complex about the world that I see happen all the time, and I don't fully understand them. And they have a lot of related properties that are, I think, quite arguable, both from the standpoint of intuition and also from the standpoint of, as it happens, a more rigorous scientific description of all of three of these phenomena. So I am just bowled over by the profundity of insight of this particular thing we have from Chazal here in Masechet Ta'anit and elsewhere in our tradition as well, recognizing it, the prophetic intuition, the Ruach Kodesh, right? The inspiration, the divine inspiration given to our sages to appreciate these relationships in a world that didn't have the benefit of all of the specialized mathematics and recently developed physical theories or whatever, and they could still see so deeply about the relationships between these different things in the world and how they point to something that may lie at the core of some of the cards that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still holding in his hand for the development of humankind's trajectory as a whole over time. And one last related point I'll make along those lines, getting back to what I mentioned before with this baracha in our tefillah, this blessing in our prayer about the resurrection of the dead, is that what Chazal are trying to show to us by saying Hashem is somech noflim, he supports the fallen, and he is rofeh cholim, and he heals the sick, and he is matir osoim, and he sets free the imprisoned, is that we can look at empirical examples that we experience in the world that allow us to affirm our trust in Hashem and our relationship to him, because we do experience things like healing and things like liberation. And we can see that, and we can see how that plays out, and how it often plays out in ways we didn't expect, and over time courses that we didn't realize, whether it's healing, right? You can injure yourself and not ever believe that you would feel better, and then find, longer than you ever imagined it could take to heal yourself. You could think that you had no hope of being healed 5 years later, and then find out 10 years later that actually there was a chance, right? And through a mechanism you didn't realize. It also could be the case that someone thinks they're going to be in prison for the rest of their life, and then, Baruch Hashem, by a set of events they don't realize. I mean, look at Yosef Tzaddik, right? The famed predictor of the agricultural future and climatological future of Mitzrayim, of Egypt. He gets out of prison in a way that no one could have expected because of the way that other prisoners connected him to the king of the land. So the Torah is showing us that in various kinds of examples, your faith in Hashem, your emunah, can be affirmed by experiences you can have, and then that can build your trust that, okay, Tchiyat Mitim is not something we're told happens all over the place every day, but we can still trust that in his time Hashem will bring it about, and that emunah can be sufficient for us to trust that he knows when, and that he has good reason not to make this something that happens like rainfall or birth or other things that are more frequently experienced. So that I think closes up a more general contemplation about this idea that we should approach the idea of Tchiyat Mitim with humility and say it is certainly part of our tradition, that this is a real promise from Hashem, and this is also something that no one who sufficiently understands the natural sciences inside and out can actually say is impossible, but rather it's something that we don't have good empirical models or theoretical models to give us guidance about, and it's not something that's meant to be accessible to science. It's meant to be something that happens so infrequently that it's not scientizable. And we can approach it as a whole by saying it's part of our emunah, and it's also part of our humility and our approach to thinking about the world scientifically, and acknowledging that although we can predict the world well, and we might be able to predict the world better in the future, that ultimately we're never going to have perfected theories of our own construction that can prove to us what lies beyond the reach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's gvura, of his might. And all of that can be perfectly consistent both with viewing the world through the eyes of a scientist and also through the eyes of an Oved Hashem with untrammeled emunah. So that I think is the main point I wanted to make. And I just had a last brief point that is a little more speculative, that maybe is following on this theme of the wisdom of our sages and their divine inspiration, their Ruach Kodesh, which they were guided by in the comments that they made to teach us about how to understand the Torah. Because I think there's a thread you can pull on in Torah that is more specifically about this topic, that may show you only in a way that maybe can help to increase emunah without claiming to prove anything, or to help one to understand that the Torah really understands a lot more, perhaps, than we sometimes give it credit, and we should be giving it, the credit of understanding much more than we ever will. So, in rapid fire, going back to the sources at the beginning, there's a source at the end of this source sheet that I can't read from because I couldn't excerpt it and it's very long, but it's in Vayikra Rabbah, where the sages say that when Tchiyat Mitim happens, it will happen from a bone that is called the Etzem Luz. It's a bone that is named after Luz, which is a city that's referred to in Tanakh. And the idea of the Etzem Luz, now the question is, what are Chazal saying by saying this bone, this indestructible bone that will be the seed from which our bodies are reborn? What is this bone, and where does it come from? I want to sweep away all subsequent attempts at mystically commenting on what this bone is, because I don't think necessarily there's any reason to give any credence to those. That I view as post-authoritative, let's say, drashic speculation about a comment by Chazal, where much later mystical commentators tried to add a kind of pseudoscience to the idea of what Etzem Luz is. And I don't think there's any reason necessarily to give credence to those. But this is an idea that goes back to Chazal. So what are Chazal talking about? When Chazal say things like this, they're not just, let's say, saying something that they would like to be true about the world. They're generally commenting on things that are actually in our prophetic texts in Tanakh, in the Torah and the statements of Nevi'im. So if we go back to source one, we can start thinking about what is the word luz? Where does it come from? So the word luz appears a few times in the Torah. And there's one of them with Yaakov Avinu that I won't refer to, but I think it is also connected. But the main things I want to focus on, it occurs multiple times in the life of Yaakov Avinu. So the first mention of luz is the second source, which is this journey of Yaakov out of Eretz Yisrael, and he goes to what becomes the place called Bet El, and he famously lies down with his head on top of a set of stones, but when he lifts his head, the Torah refers to one stone, an Evan, and he pours oil over the stone and he calls the place Bet El, but the Torah happens to mention just this place was called Luz. And Luz turns out to be the name of a kind of tree. We have, in translation, the idea that it's maybe almonds or some kind of nuts, and this is confirmed elsewhere with another source from Yaakov Avinu. But I mention it in source one because the other thing that Luz comes in for is when Yaakov is working for Lavan, he's doing animal husbandry, and he's trying to manipulate the heritable traits of these sheep that he's breeding so that they come out speckled or striped or whatever, so that he can get a better yield from his investment of effort in raising sheep based on his agreement with Lavan about which sheep become his. And that is a very interesting passage that we could talk about a lot on its own. But one thing that's mentioned is he uses sticks that are from the tree that's called luz, and he's putting stripes on the sticks and putting them next to the animals. And I think it's very reasonable to read this, that he's not trying to magically induce changes in the animals by putting sticks next to them. He's labeling them, right? That if you were going to keep track for purposes of crossbreeding animals, you would want to know about the traits of themselves, which you can see, and their ancestors, which you can't see. So you need sticks that have labels on them with stripes in order to actually keep track of who had what parents of what kind. And then you get the ones that you want to interbreed with each other, and you can increase the yield as you wish. And so it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that Yaakov Avinu is actually trying to exploit actual genetics in what he's doing. I don't think it's the only reading, and I don't think it has to be. But I do think it's an important one for us to acknowledge as a possibility. And it pertains here because what I'm starting to pull together here is, okay, what do we have? We have luz as being associated with heritable traits when you breed animals, because that's, animal husbandry. It comes up when Yaakov is getting animals to try to have certain traits. And then we also have luz popping up over in Bethel when what happens? When Yaakov has this dream where he sees a ladder with malachim, with messengers, olim v'yordim, arising and descending. And he names the place Bethel, but it was originally called Luz. And also we have this idea that Chazal point to specifically of a set of stones, plural, that he lies down on, and a single stone that he lifts his head from, where stones, plural, have joined back together into a stone, a single stone. So what do I want to make out of this as a whole? So this is the thing that's kind of wild, and I don't want to lead too heavily on it, but I think it is remarkable enough to note and to cause us to contemplate at least. If I put together the idea of heredity from the animals on the one hand, the first mention of Luz, and a ladder with messengers that are ascending and descending, as a scientist, it's very hard not to also be reminded of something immediately. If you say to a natural scientist, I'm thinking of something that's a ladder with a message that's descending and a message that's ascending, and also the idea of heredity when you interbreed animals, they'd say, oh, DNA, of course, right? Because DNA, what is it? It's a molecule that our model of DNA that helps us to predict what it does is that it's a ladder with a descending message strand and an ascending message strand, where scientists talk about these strands of DNA as though they are messages that bear information, and that double helix, that ladder shape, becomes the basis for the transmission of heritable traits from one generation to the next. So remember why we started this discussion. We started talking about Luz because Chazal, our sages, told us that Luz is about the idea of bringing back to life that which has died, and the bone, the sort of indestructible part of a living thing, that could be used as the seed from which the rest of the living thing could be reconstituted. And remarkably, when we follow that thread of Luz, we come to a place where various things happen. One is we have the idea of rocks, plural, coming back together into a single rock. So it's the idea of reassembling that which seems to be irrevocably broken apart. If you shatter a rock, you cannot put the rock back together. In the empirical everyday experience of a human being, rocks that break apart, they may fit back together, but they don't stick back together. They are shattered and separated, and you always have rocks afterwards. You don't have rock. But Yaakov is going in the opposite direction, right? He's starting with rocks and he's going to rock. So it's the idea of reunifying broken apart pieces. That's there at Luz, at this place called Luz. And also what's there in the word Luz is the idea of heredity through breeding on the one hand with the animals, and on the other hand, a ladder with a message that's descending and a message that's ascending. So I don't want to add this all up and say, aha, so this means that Chazal secretly knew everything that Watson and Crick knew, and they were just hiding it from us. I think that that's kind of a facile and preposterous way of taking things from this point. But what I will say is that I think we often underestimate the degree to which the prophetic imagination with which our tradition is fired can look at the world as experienced by human beings who observe it and appreciate profound things about it that we think of as being extremely difficult to uncover without, mountains and mountains of specially developed technology and thinking that took centuries to accumulate. And so it needn't be the case that if you went to Chazal and said, oh, you know what DNA is, right? That they would say, oh yeah, definitely, deoxyribonucleic acid, etc. That conversation is not one we should be imagining, but I think it could still be the case that when we talk about Nivuah and Ruach Kodesh, when we talk about the kind of truth about the world that's available to the inspiration of someone who's relating to it as one who is communing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the creator of the world, who understands everything about how it works, and is finding a way of communicating with him and understanding things that he wants to teach us, there may be a lot more that's available to that intuition than we first realized, and that may at least turn out to parallel other kinds of imaginative intuition that people have developed as they've applied it when trying to understand things scientifically. And that, I think, ultimately, I don't mean that therefore we connect this back. And now we know that the way team works is just like Jurassic Park. You get the DNA and you build, the animal again, and that's exactly how it's supposed to be. On the contrary, I think what this is supposed to do is to say, let's have humility. Let's not claim we understand how it all is supposed to fit together, and let's at least by perhaps being a bit awestruck or pushed to marvel a bit at what Chazal and our prophetic texts can appreciate about the world, and also by being reminded of the limitations of what we get by reasoning scientifically about the natural world, that we may find it easier, or at least, let's say, something we're more motivated to try to do with that humility, to develop the emunah that allows us to say, Hashem can support us when we're fallen, Hashem can heal us when we're sick, he can set us free when we're imprisoned, and he also too can bring us to life in his time and when he chooses.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ringland.
My pleasure, as always.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.